right, last chapter. This is chapter 38, and this is focusing on conservation biology and biodiversity and how we can keep ecosystems really diverse on Earth and why it's important that we have diversity and that we protect that. We know that humans are having a lot of impact on diversity in a bad way, and so we need to be mindful of that and look at how we can help protect biodiversity in our world. These are some mass extinctions that have happened in history, and the pie charts here are how many different species that were on Earth were extinct, and we base this off the fossil record. So the KT was the most recent one, and 80% death rate on that one, and then you have quite a lot in the previous ones, and they have the likely causes. So KT was probably because of an asteroid impact or volcanic levels or falling sea levels, and so you can see what the results were. And we have the other four were changes to global temperature, so rapid cooling and rapid heating. So those are things that we should learn from and try to see how that affected the organisms and how we can prevent those drastic changes. And here they are again. So these are extinctions. The end Cretaceous, the KT1, Triassic, Permian, Devonian, Ordovician. And this is how they separate these different eras and epochs by the mass extinctions. So 5 of them. This is the KT mass extinction, this boundary, and they find this iridium spike at this layer where they're looking at when this KT extinction happened. And so this might have been from an asteroid impact. We might see this iridium spike from an asteroid. And so that's some of the evidence they use to try to determine what caused it. When we're looking at biodiversity, we are looking at different types of biodiversity. Probably the most common one that we think of is species diversity, so this middle one. And in that one, we're looking at how many different species are there in an area. But there are other types of diversity we need to protect also. So if we go bigger than that, ecosystem diversity is making sure that we have lots of different types of ecosystems and a variety of habitats, and that we're protecting all of those, even microhabitats in an area, because we know there's a lot of different species there. So if we're protecting ecosystem diversity, we are then also protecting species diversity. And then we can go lower than that. We can go to genetic diversity and see that we're looking at different allele frequencies in a population and how we can protect those differences. And so we need to consider all 3 levels when we're talking about biodiversity. And here's another look at that too. So ecological diversity is looking at those habitats and niches. Species diversity is the number of different species, and then genetic diversity is more on looking at genes and combinations of genes. And here's one example. This is Lake Victoria in Africa, which is right on the upper northern part of Uganda. It's a beautiful area. I've seen pictures. We see a lot of evolutionary findings, but we also see a lot of biodiversity loss in that area. So that's one area that we can look to for some of this biodiversity loss. We can also look at coral reefs. So right now we know that coral reefs are changing drastically, and this is a site, they're kind of a keystone species where a lot of different organisms rely on them, and they allow for a lot of biodiversity, and so we need to make sure we're protecting them. But we're seeing a lot of changes in coral reefs, the bleaching of it due to climate change and changes in pH in the ocean. And then a prairie is also an area of great biodiversity, and so we need to make sure that we're also protecting prairie land and others too. So this is showing the amount of biodiversity in different areas, and you can see that the orange and dark red, that's where we have the highest amount of biodiversity, which you would expect to be near the equator. And this word endemic species, these are the species that are only found in one location, and if they die off there, then they'll be gone, they'll be extinct. So we need to make sure that we are protecting those endemic species for sure. And you can see in Africa, this is interesting, the white part in Africa here and that blue, that's showing, and this is just amphibians. I should have noted that. This is just amphibians. You can see that there's a low proportion here, and this is where we have the Saharan desert. So, and that desert is getting bigger. There's a lot of people that are affected by that, and organisms, due to climate change. So, so yeah, these are some interesting patterns that we see globally, and we need to keep an eye on this, right? And make sure that these aren't changing too much. Here are some biodiversity hotspots, and in these spots, we see a lot of endemic species where this is the only place they live, those organisms, those endemic ones, and we have to be really sure that we're protecting those organisms which don't live anywhere else. So those are kind of some hot spots that we really focus on with conservation biology. And when we look at this species area relationship, as the area increases, the number of species increases, but it's not linear. So we need to make sure that we're keeping that in mind. As we are losing more habitat, we're also going to lose more species. So as we're looking at more land, that's going to cause more species to be lost potentially. So we need to make sure we're protecting habitats. So now let's look at how humans can affect biodiversity, and how it's important to really consider that. So this is a Madagascar periwinkle, and it is a medicinal plant, and it's being researched and used now for treatment of lymphomas. And so this is one example of why we need to protect biodiversity. We might have a lot of organisms that some we don't even know about that could be used to make the world a better place, but we have to make sure that we're protecting these organisms and not kind of abusing them and causing them to be killed off. This is a global seed vault in Norway, and it's where we store really diverse crops. And we have a lot of diversity in our crops. We need to make sure that we're maintaining that and protecting that, and that our activities are not limiting that, especially when it comes to pollution and climate change. And honeybees are also something that we really need to be protected, not just because we like honey, but because they pollinate a lot of different plants, right? So we need to make sure that we're protecting them also. Overfishing is something that we don't think about in our region because we don't have, we're not near an ocean. So we don't have that industry that we see every day. But overfishing can cause drastic changes in marine environments and other aquatic systems. And so we need to make sure that we are being good stewards of our marine environments and not overfishing and abusing that resource, and that we're doing it in a sustainable way. And the other value of biodiversity is psychological and moral value. And so what this means is that we get a lot of psychological value out of going out and being part of nature. And I think we're all pretty well aware of that in our area. There are some kids that live in really urban areas and they don't have a chance to experience that. I think all of you, that's an important part of your life, that you spend time outside with nature and with animals. And so we need to consider that part of biodiversity, and that's kind of part of being human, and that's a really important piece of biodiversity. And this graph here shows that the higher the species richness, the higher the psychological restoration. Section 3 is threats to biodiversity. So these are some pictures showing how we can threaten biodiversity. These are the 4 greatest threats. So the first one is habitat loss, and we would see that here in this bottom picture. You can see that this rainforest area was turned into cropland. We see that even here. We see that if we do farming, we are getting rid of native plants in some areas, and we need to be mindful of that. And there are a lot of consequences to switching to farming from native habitats, native plants. One consequence is the wind can cause a lot of erosion when you don't have the plants that hold the soil, that native forage. And they also are less likely to hold the snow in the wintertime. So you're gonna have less precipitation sitting there on the soil. As you would see in this picture, you would predict that there'd be less precipitation there. And that can be a huge problem. And then it also causes snow to move and like closed roads and things like that. We also need to be careful of over harvesting. The picture here with the big mountain, those are bison skulls. This is a really famous picture. Obviously, they were over-harvested. A lot of the reason they were over-harvested is because they were trying really creative, harmful ways to kind of annihilate the Native American population. So they wanted to remove the bison resource from these indigenous populations so they didn't have that food. So they were not killing these bison for food. They were killing them to try to choke out Native Americans. But it's a good example of over-harvesting. And then introduction of exotic species. What we see here in the bottom, these are fire ants. And this is really close to my heart because I've done research on fire ants, and Jolynn knows about this. But fire ants do not occur here in Montana, thankfully, as of yet. The farthest north probably by now is like maybe Northern California because it's too cold up here. But we had some fire ants that were introduced to North America in the 70s, I think, probably on a shipment of hay around the Gulf of Mexico. We do have native fire ants here, and then these imported ones, introduced ones, were from Brazil. They're super aggressive. They took over the Southwest. They're a huge problem now. The native ones are also like annoying, but they're not as crazy as these. So we see that a lot with exotic species and imported organisms. It's pretty dangerous. They don't fit into our food web, interestingly, even though they're really similar to our native stuff. And then, of course, the other threat to biodiversity is climate change. So these are all things that we are doing as people, and we need to make sure that we're being good stewards of our environments and we're not causing some of these problems. And then this is showing you atmospheric carbon in the last 500,000 years. And you can see that the rates of carbon are going way up right now, and they were much lower. So it is natural to see carbon cycles, but not to see the levels as high as they are. They're also increasing at a rate about 15 times higher than they ever have been. And the temperature, the global temperature, is also increasing at a rate that's about 15 times higher than it ever has. We've seen changes in temperature before historically, but it's never increased so fast. And that's why scientists are concerned. So this is habitat loss. And you can see this little orangutan, this cute little guy. He only lives in rainforests of Borneo, so he's endemic to Borneo, which is in this picture here, in that area between Malaysia and that other country, or maybe that's all Malaysia. I think it's all Malaysia. And then another species is only found in the rainforests of Sumatra, which are over here on this side. So we need to make sure that we're protecting these organisms because this is the only place they live. Same thing with the Sumatran tiger and the Sumatran elephant. They're critically endangered. They only live there. If we lose them there, they'll be gone. So rainforests are commonly replaced and farmed and turned into, in this case, plantations, oil palm plantations to make money. And so we need to make sure that we are, so here's a picture of the plantation. We need to make sure that we're protecting these endemic species or we'll lose them altogether just because we're trying to farm everything. And then over harvesting, we can look at the example of fishing. So on the top of this graph, this is a pretty cool graphic. You can see the demand for fish. So right now, projected 2030, we are expecting 140 million tons of fish. And the supply is much lower. And so, and it's expected to go down because we're over harvesting the fish. And so we need to make sure that we are kind of reforming this industry and making sure that we're using sustainable practices so we don't overfish and overharvest. And we need to be careful of introducing exotic species like the fire ant. This is a brown tree snake. It's exotic, and it's caused extinctions in Guam because it was accidentally introduced and then it blew up. So a lot of times you'll see imported species just explode when they're introduced because they don't belong in that food web and they don't have any natural checks to prevent that. And this is an exotic species that was affected by a fungus, and I have a typo there. It can cause a global decline. So these are dying of this fungal disease, and it causes them to have red lesions. And so some of these can be, and the fungus is an exotic species that was introduced either naturally or man-caused. But we can also see huge changes like that. And then here's a little brown bat. This is another exotic fungus that affects bats. And this is in Vermont. So the bats are native to here, but the fungus is not, and it's killing off the bats. And there's nothing to really, they don't have immunity towards it. There's nothing to really help them. And then this is a Brazilian pepper tree. It was introduced to Florida, so it's from Brazil. And now it's widespread, and it creates too much shade for the other plants to survive. And there's lots of other examples of plants like this that have invaded and just taken over. And then we can also see changes in habitats due to climate change. And so the dark brown in this map is where grizzly bears used to live. And then you can kind of see their extended range and then the polar bear habitat. And now their range is getting much smaller. And you can see that there was some overlap up there. Let's see, I'm going to read through this a little bit. As a result, grizzly bear habitat now overlaps polar bear habitat. And so these two kinds of bears, they're capable of mating and producing viable offspring, but they're still considered separate species. And before this, they had never been in the same place at the same time. And so it looks like in 2006, a hunter shot a wild grizzly polar bear, which is known as a growler bear. It was the first one ever found. And so these climate change can cause these habitats to shift and weird things to happen. And they can really affect the food web in these different ecosystems. So to preserve biodiversity, we really need to know how to measure it. And so this is a graph showing how many mammals, birds, reptiles, etc., are critically endangered, or vulnerable. And we need to really be able to track these well and to see if they're changing and how we should respond if they're changing. And these are some laws or things that have happened in that would help with preserving biodiversity. So we do have some hunting and fishing laws to protect biodiversity. We have the Endangered Species Act. We have recovery plans, private land and critical habitat that is protected. We have minimal viable populations, where we're looking at what is that minimal number that we need to maintain to keep the populations going. We're protecting habitats. We have treaties. We have zoos to protect organisms and breed them and move them around. Botanical gardens, captive breeding programs like Tiger King, just kidding, and then climate change mitigation. So we do have a lot of really good programs, and we need to keep doing this, because if we're not careful, it's really easy, especially with like imported species, to wipe out a whole food chain. We saw that with the opossum shrimp. And another example is Yellowstone. So they are working really well with trying to restore the habitat in Yellowstone. And this is really hard work. It's really hard to predict how this is going to go and how to do it well. But they're trying to restore it to what it was like historically. And they are looking at like wolves, obviously, and the elk populations, and how climate change is affecting them and how it's affecting their forage and what they have access to, and how that can affect the whole food web. And that is all of chapter 38.